Over the years, people have asked me which calendar I keep. They ask if I keep the Hillel or the Zadok or some other calendar. And I always have to tell people that I calculate it myself with my own understanding of scripture and just everything that I've found through reading and astronomical study, which is very limited. But I figured instead of having to always explain myself, I would just make this video here today that I can refer people to, and you can see how I make the calendar. And if knowing exactly how I made the calendar to pick the feast dates that are available on the Sojourn website doesn't really interest you that much, then you can go ahead and jump to the end of the video where I'll leave a timestamp in the YouTube chapters for the video explaining why I don't think that the discourse surrounding the calendar and how to calculate it and which calendar is correct is really worth our time, effort, and energy. Because I do think that there is something more important that people are frequently missing. Thankfully, when it comes to figuring out the feast days, Scripture gives us very explicit instructions on how to calculate them. We know that the Passover lands on the 14th evening of the first month, and other feast days have very, very explicit instructions as well. The problem why there's so many different calendars and so many different trains of thought and opinions is that we don't have any explicit instructions for when the year actually starts, how months are structured, anything like that. And that's where the disagreement comes in. But we do have implicit instructions. So what we can do, first thing we should always do, is turn to Scripture. If we look at Exodus 9:31 through 32, it says this: "The flax and the barley were struck down, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in the bud. But the wheat and the emmer were not struck down, for they are late and coming up." In context, this is during the plagues on Egypt during the Exodus story. And if we take this verse and read a little bit later in the story, we have Exodus 12:1 through 2, which says, "And Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." So this is shortly after the barley was struck down. And if we take a look at Egypt's agricultural cycle, this actually gives us a really nice window of a time frame of what time of year this actually occurred. And this occurred somewhere in the very, very late winter or very, very early spring, somewhere right in that window. And that gives us a really good idea of around the time of year the year actually begins in Scripture. So it sits somewhere right around the vernal equinox, which is very, very, very helpful. And I know that there are groups that go out to try to determine the beginning of the year every year. And part of the way that they do it is they look at the agricultural cycle and when the barley's coming up and the flax and before the wheat has come up. I think that's kind of an egregious, or not egregious, but maybe erroneous way to go about it, because the crop development does not determine the year. The year's beginning is not contingent on the crops. Because, I mean, imagine years of famine, right? When there's no food growing, does the year just not start? No, this is just a sign of the time of the year. So it's something to consider, but it's not a determining factor. But we do know, because of usual agricultural cycles, the beginning of the year, according to Scripture, starts somewhere around the vernal equinox. So now that we have an idea of a window of when the year starts, let's actually start looking at how the year is structured. And the easiest way to do that is to try to figure out how months are determined. So let's turn to Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. It says, "And God said, Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." And the thing about the word for seasons is the original Hebrew word is actually moedim, which doesn't refer to seasons and instead refers to set apart times or appointed times or the feast dates. So we know that the sun and the moon are both used to help us determine feast dates, okay? So they both have to work in this structure that we have. In Psalm 81:3, it says, "Blow the trumpet at the new moon, at the full moon, on our feast day." So again, we just have a verse here that's showing us that a feast day seems to occur on a full moon and a new moon. It doesn't say which specific feast day it is, but it's pretty telling that the full moon and new moon seem to have something to do with it. And if we read in Psalm 104:19, it says, "He made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting." And again, the word seasons here is actually moedim, meaning appointed times. So with just this little bit of scripture we have so far, we can see that it really does seem to imply that the moon has some major factor in its cycles and phases determining when feast dates occur. However, if we look in passages like Leviticus 23:24, which says, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall observe a day of solemn rest, a memorial proclaimed with a blast of trumpets, a holy convocation." So we have passages that are telling us that seemingly that specific moon phases determine when feast dates are held, but also feast dates are given very specific days within a month, like the Feast of Trumpets here being on the 1st day of the 7th month. And so if both those things have to be possible, where a new moon or a full moon determines a feast day, but also a day within a month determines a feast day, then that would imply that specific days of the months are counted by specific phases of the moon. It would really, really imply that the moon's purpose is to help determine months. Now we just got to figure out how that works and how that is. So what we have so far is that we have the beginning of the year starts somewhere around the vernal equinox, determined by the sun's movement, and I'll get into that a little bit more, and that months are most likely dictated by the moon. And as far as I know, this is pretty much, I mean, there's other verses to help bolster these ideas, but there's nothing that really flat out just says how the year is structured in our 66 canon. And so in order to get more information, sometimes we have to look outside of that. And there is a book that does talk about the structure of the year, the structure of the months, and the structures of the seasons that are much more explicit in content than how implicit it is in our 66 canon, and that is the Book of Enoch. Now, I don't really care what your thoughts are on the Book of Enoch for the sake of this video. I'm not going to spend any time trying to justify my use of it, other than to say whether or not you believe the stories that are told regarding the Nephilim, the Watchers, and all the other aspects of it. When they talk about their observations of nature, it is a really unique window into that time in history and the way that people understood how the heavenly bodies moved and worked. And so there is some value that you can get out of it, even if you don't believe the stories. So we're going to use Enoch and see how it describes how the year works to see if we can figure out exactly when these feast dates occur. And for this, I am going to be using the Sefer's version of it. And I know the Sefer has problems. I'm well aware. I haven't seen or found a translation of the Bible that does not have its own unique problems. But as far as the Book of Enoch specifically goes, I much prefer the way the Sefer translates the Book of Enoch as opposed to people like R.H. Charles. I have a number of issues with the way that R.H. Charles translates. So, I mean, I appreciate the work he's put in, but we're going to use the Sefer for this. So we're going to start off at Enoch 72, verses 1 through 5. The Sefer of the revolutions of the luminaries of heaven, according to the respective classes, the respective powers, the respective periods, the respective names, the places where they commenced their progress, and their respective months, which Uriel, the holy angel who was with me, explained to me, he who conducted them. The whole account of them according to every year of the world forever, until a new work shall be effected, which will be eternal. This is the first law of the luminaries. The sun and the light arrive at the gates of heaven, which are on the east, and on the west of it at the western gates of heaven. I beheld the gates whence the sun goes forth, and the gates where the sun sets, in which gates also the moon rises and sets, and the conductors of the stars, among those who precede them, 6 at the rising and 6 at the setting of the sun. All these respectively, one after another, are on a level, and numerous windows are on the right and on the left sides of those gates. So contextually, there's not a ton of information right there. Basically, this is just a preamble preparing you to realize, okay, hey, I'm going to explain how the sun and the moon work. So what we're going to do is we're just going to keep reading on in the chapter and try to dissect how the sun works, and then we'll move on to the moon. So continuing on, verse 6, first proceeds forth that great luminary, which is called the sun, the orb of which is as the orb of heaven, and the whole of it being replete with splendid and flaming fire. Its chariot, where it ascends, the wind blows, and the sun sets in heaven, and returning by the north to proceed towards the east, it is conducted so as to enter by that gate, and illuminate the face of heaven. In the same manner it goes forth in the first month by the great gate. It goes forth through the fourth of those 6 gates, which are at the rising of the sun. And in the fourth gate, from which the sun rises in the first month, there are 12 open windows, from which issues out a flame when they are opened in their proper periods. That was a lot of information, but right now what it's telling us is that the sun moves through very specific gates at very specific times. And I'll explain what those gates are here in a little bit, because some translations even say portals, and that's a very confusing concept with most people's very limited understanding of astronomical features. And so the really key thing here is that when the sun rises and goes forth in the fourth gate, that is the first month of the year. This happens in the first month. Okay, let's continue reading on. Verse 12. When the sun rises in heaven, it goes through this fourth gate 30 days, and by the fourth gate in the west of heaven on a level with it descends. During that period, the day is lengthened from the day, and the night curtailed from the night for 30 days. And then the day is longer by 2 parts than the night. The day is precisely 10 parts, and the night is 8. The sun goes forth through this fourth gate, and sets in it, and returns to the fifth gate during 30 days, after which it proceeds from and sets in the fifth gate. I know that was a little confusing, but try to bear with me on this. The gates being referred to here in Enoch could be best easily explained as latitude lines. When you look at a map and you see the latitude lines going all across the map and the nations, these are essentially the gates, or at least some of them are the gates. And the fourth gate happens to be the equator. Now, how do we know this? Because in the passage that we just read where it describes the movement of the sun, saying it's moving towards the fifth gate, and the portion of its light is increasing by 2 parts. When you continue to read through the chapter, I'm not going to read through all of this, that you'll see as it moves from gate to gate, it either increases in light or decreases in light. And it rises up, increases in light, making it 2 parts longer than night, which means when it starts off in the fourth gate, the day and night portions of light are equal. And the only place that you get that they're equal like that is during an equinox, either a autumn equinox or a vernal equinox. And that occurs when the sun passes the equator point or is right on the equator point. So this fourth gate is the equator. And the thing about this too is as the sun is moving, assuming that, where this writing is taking place is in the north, like, Israel, then as the sun would move into the fifth gate and increase its portion of light, it's actually moving towards summer, which means that this time passing through the fourth gate, going to summer in the north, that means this is the vernal equinox, which is very, very consistent with what we have in R66. And I know it may be a weird thought to have the sun moving across latitude lines as it's going across the sky, but it does throughout the year. In fact, there's this thing called a solar analemma. If you take a picture of the sun at different points in time throughout the year at the same time of day, each time you do it, then you'll actually see how the sun moves in a figure 8 shape, because it's not just moving east to west, it's also moving slightly north and south depending on the season that you're in. And that's how we get our seasons. So if you keep reading, you'll see that the sun moves between the gates every 30 days, or sometimes it'll stay in a gate twice, and then you'll have a 31st day during the equinoxes and the solstices. And most people stop right there and say, okay, hey, we know that the sun begins in the vernal equinox, and that's the beginning of the year. That's the first month of the year. Done. Moves 30 days across to another gate. Each month is 30 days. We're done. Like, that's how the year works. And that's what the Enoch calendar does. But I want to point out something to you, is that what we read in Genesis implies that the moon and the sun have to both work together in order for us to determine our years. You can't just rely on the sun alone. And I know that some people will say that the moon just acts as a witness to the sun. I don't buy that, because when you read through Enoch and you're actually looking through this, it says that it moves in the fourth gate in the first month, but it doesn't say that the sun's movement determines the months, not month to month. In fact, if anything, the function of the sun would be to determine around when the year begins, and it would also help us determine when the seasons change. But there's nothing about it determining the months. These 30-day cycles are just how the sun moves in the sky. It's not exactly blatantly saying here that the sun determines the months. So I think that there's more to it. We really need to investigate how the moon works in all of this. So moving forward in Enoch, let's read about the moon now. Starting chapter 73, verse 1. After this I beheld another law of an inferior luminary, the name of which is the moon, and the orb of which is as the orb of heaven. Its chariot secretly ascends, the wind blows, and the light is given into it by measure. Every month at its exit and entrance it becomes changed, and its periods are as the periods of the sun. And when the moon is full, its light is a seventh portion from the light of the sun. Thus it rises, and at its commencement towards the east goes forth for 30 days. At the time it appears and becomes to you the beginning of the month. 30 days with the sun in the gate from which the sun goes forth. Half of it is in extent 7 portions, 1, and the whole of its orb is void of light, except a 7th portion out of the 14 portions of its light. And in a day it receives a 7th portion, or half of its light. Its light is by sevens, by 1 portion, and by the half. It sets with the sun. So that, again, Enoch is a little confusing, but this really just tells us how the phases of the moon works. That each day it gains a 7th of a portion of light. And we'll get into it a little bit more, and you'll see a little bit more about how that works. But this implies that when it comes in at the beginning of its cycle, it is devoid of light aside from 1 little portion, right? So that would imply a waxing crescent moon. And I don't want to spend too much time in Enoch, but to get a little bit more information about the moon, I'm going to jump ahead to Enoch 78. Starting verse 5, we see, when the moon rises, it appears in heaven, and the half of a 7th portion of light is all in it. In 14, the whole of its light is completed. 3 quintuplets of light are put into it until 15 its light is completed. According to the signs of the year, it has 3 quintuplets. So by the 15th day, or the 15th time of the portion of light coming into it, its light is completed. This implies it's a full moon, because if you keep reading after this, you'll see that the light becomes diminished by a portion each day after this cycle. Let's jump down to verse 14. And when it is wholly extinguished, its light is consumed in heaven, and on the first day it is called the new moon, for on that day light is received into it. So if we put everything we read in Enoch here together with what we covered in Genesis, Exodus, and Psalms, we start to get a really good picture of how the year possibly works. So the year begins when the sun rises in the 4th gate, that is the vernal equinox. But the months, according to what we have in Scripture and what's implied in Enoch, is determined by the phases of the moon. And what we see here is that the moon becomes complete on the 15th day, being the full moon, and when it's mostly devoid of light, except for a little portion of light, is the beginning of its phases. So this would imply that the year starts when we have the sun entering into the vernal equinox and when the moon first gains light. And that is the beginning of months. And of course, after that, each month is heralded by the same subsequent thing. Each time the moon rises up and has a new portion of light after having been devoid. Now we're going to move on to actually building the calendar with all of this information, but I do have to make a quick comment that there is a passage in Enoch that implies that people who rely on the moon, and I think this might be part of the reason why the Enoch calendar doesn't use the moon, is because the moon lags behind the sun, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, this lag every year. And there's a passage in Enoch that does imply that men who rely on the moon will greatly err in determining God's holy days. But that's part of the reason why we don't use the moon alone. We got to use the moon and the sun together, because the sun entering through the vernal equinox is our great reset point. If you just follow the moon, you're going to get messed up. If you just follow the sun, you're going to get messed up. You got to use both of them. They got to work together. So the first thing I look into when trying to determine the beginning of the year is I find out when the vernal equinox is, or at least a rough window of the vernal equinox. And I do that just with a quick Google search, honestly. So if we look here, we see that the vernal equinox of 2026 lands on March 20th. Cool, we have our vernal equinox. Now let's determine the moon phases. So I use this website, but really you can use anything that has similar features to this to help me determine moon phases and the times of day. It's very helpful because it actually shows you when there's a sunset, sunrise, moonset, moonrise, moonlight, and all of that's going to be really helpful to us to actually determine when this is going to happen. So let's go to when the vernal equinox is, and that is March 2026. Now, a really important thing that I have to make clear here is the difference between an equinox and an equilux. And that's when things get a little messy and a little confusing, because the equinox and the equilux are not always on the same day. The equinox is more of a worldwide average of all the local equiluxes. And if you really want to look into that more, I encourage you to Google into that. But what is important to know here is that the equinox is not exact. It's not this exact thing depending on where you live. So yes, it says March 20th, but really it just gives us a range here, which I know isn't the most helpful, but it does give us a range. Now, we run into another problem, and that problem is you see these phases here, these phases of illumination of the moon, and there is a lot of debate over the required illumination percentage in order to qualify as visibility and qualify it to be the new moon. So there's arguments over, oh, this new moon isn't actually a new moon, you know. Nobody can agree on this, and it gives us a range. I think being part of those debates is really, really exhausting and just time-consuming pointlessly, because it is really speculative at this point. You got to think about atmospheric conditions, and where you live, it's exhausting. And I am not of the mind that ancient peoples were so far detached from astronomical study and observation to the level that we are today. You ask the average person if they understand how the moon moves across the sky, and they're not going to be able to tell you, because most people don't even know what an analemma is. And yes, the moon has its own analemma, which is pretty cool. And with their better understanding or better observation of lunar and solar cycles, I do think that they weren't just having to sit around and guess and observe the moon for when the moon cycles are coming. I'm sure that they had perfected a way to predict what the lunar cycles were going to be. And I know from the rabbinical writings, there was a period where they were relying on the observation of the sky, but I am not convinced that it was always that way. What we do know is that the moon reaches its full brightness on the 15th day. So what I've opted to start doing is I just go to when the moon is full and then to call that the 15th day and work backwards if need be. So let's do that in determining the Passover. So if we go along in March, you can see that we never quite reach the full moon. So we're gonna have to flip over to April. Now, down here, there's a handy little piece of information here that tells us exactly when the full moon is. 100% illumination is on April 2nd. And we know that that would be the 15th day, and Passover takes place on the 14th night, which would mean Passover, is the night of April 1st. Now, if you looked at the feast dates I posted, you'll notice that I actually put Passover on March 31st and not April 1st, and I'm sure you're wondering why that would be. And this is where we come into a caveat where I become an outlier for a lot of people's thought processes. Even within my own fellowship, the thought on this is pretty divided. But I do not agree with most Jewish or Torah-keeping groups, the idea that the day begins when the sun sets. In fact, I think that there is enough scripture in place to indicate that the day begins when the sun rises. And as a quick aside, the whole idea of dividing days at midnight, I don't feel like I should have to say this, but the whole idea of dividing days at midnight is not something that God prescribed for us. That is a very arbitrary, modern day human understanding of how to separate days. We're talking about God's time. And we can't agree that it is depending on the movement of the sun. It's just the question is, does the day begin when the sun sets or the sun rises? And I've given a video presentation about this before, and you can actually find it on this channel if you want to see the friendly debate we had about it, where I gave a lot of scriptural reasons for why I believe it begins when the sun rises. So I'm not going to rehash that all here. However, my views and understanding have been even more bolstered, and I have more arrows in my quiver, so to speak, on this topic than I did when I made that video. So this will be something I will very likely revisit. And before you completely write me off on this thing, I have two things really quick I want to say about it. I really highly suggest that you go read Exodus 12 and then you read Numbers 33 verse 3 and try to make these two accounts work together if the day begins at night. And not only that, I'm not alone in this thought process. I'm not some crazy nut job out here who's completely missing the mark, you know. Even in today's discourse, you have scholars and rabbis who don't agree on this topic. There are reports, you can go online and read about them, where people say, yeah, there's a lot of compelling evidence that the day begins at sunrise, but we've always traditionally done it that it begins at sundown, so we're just gonna keep it that way. I'm not that kind of guy. So let's revisit this and find out why I'm a whole day off from what you might expect to see here. So yes, the full moon does take place on April 2nd, but April 2nd is the determination that's made by midnight. It's not even made by sunrise or sundown. So we got to look at when the sun actually rises, because if we look here, we can see that the full moon takes place on April 2nd at 5:11 a.m. So when does the sun rise? Well, the sun doesn't rise until 6:30 a.m. Uh-oh. That means that the moon becomes full a whole hour before April 2nd starts, which means that the 15th day, when the sun is full, is actually occurring on April 1st, just really late in the day. But it is April 1st, which makes April 1st the 15th day of the month, making Passover the night before, March 31st. And so with this structure, we just move forward and you go through and you look at the moon phases and you look at Leviticus 23 that tells you which days of each month that the feasts land on, and you just calculate it in this manner, being very careful to pay attention to when the sun rises versus when the moon is full. And when you do this, you get all the dates that I have presented on the Sojourn Fellowship Church website. Now, two things to talk about that I didn't mention here in how I structure the calendar. One is I didn't talk about the stars at all. The stars, I do believe, play a part in understanding our time and understanding God's calendar, but I'm not so sure that the stars are a necessary element when just trying to figure out each year in a self-contained thing. The stars seem to be something much more widespread that helps us determine which year we are in within a decade or a century, and that's not really necessary when just trying to determine feast dates within a year. However, I would like to learn more about how the stars work and the constellations, and I'm sure that would help bolster my understanding and may even change the way that I calculate the calendar. I don't know. We'll have to see as the years go by. And speaking of figuring out the feast dates, you can see here I only figured out the feast dates. I am not personally interested in mapping out and structuring every single day of God's year, and a big part of that is because it doesn't really matter to me. I mean, within my culture and the world living here in the US, I have to arrange everything by the Gregorian calendar. It's only really with these feast dates do I need to figure out and calculate all this stuff. And I know that there's some people who are more interested in figuring out the entire calendar and every single day as it goes because people like to keep Jewish feasts on those. But I personally am not interested in keeping man-made holidays like that. I want to know the feast that God told us to keep. And that's really all I'm interested in. Now, before the video is over, there is something really important I want to talk to you about. And that is that I do not think that this conversation about the calendars should be such a huge point of focus and discussion amongst Torah-keeping Christians. I don't. I think it's a distraction. I think that it has become a huge distraction that takes us away from fellowship and from other really good forms of study. Because the calendars, I have seen people refuse to participate in congregations or break off or just be unwilling to fellowship in any capacity because somebody else's calendar doesn't line up with theirs. And I've had people call me and ask me, and their whole contingency on even fellowshipping with us was which calendar we used. And that's just wild to me because there is so much open room for interpretation and making errors from all this information that we have to design the calendar that for any one person to sit here and say that their calendar is 100% right, has no faults, and everyone else should conform to it is honestly very arrogant. It's very proud and arrogant. Like, I'm not sitting here trying to tell you, this is the true calendar. I don't know. I'm letting you know how I calculate it based on my understanding of scripture, but I'm fallible, and until we find some missing scripture or something that God's blatantly like, this is how it works, even that's going to take a ton of investigation. There's just too much room for interpretation. And when you're doing this, when you're breaking up fellowship and refusing to participate with others because you guys can't agree on which day is holy, I'm telling you right now, you are missing the forest for the trees. You are. The point of gauging in the holy days is to honor Jesus and to honor his Father and to fellowship with our brothers and sisters. And if you are doing this all by yourself because you refuse to fellowship with your brothers and sisters because you can't agree about a day that you probably have wrong anyway, that is completely missing the point. You are not acting in love, and this is not pleasing to God. I want to dive into Romans 14 for a bit. We're not going to read the whole chapter, but we will read a decent section of this. We're going to skip around a little bit. Romans 14, verse 1 through 9 says, As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person only eats vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us live to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. Now he's talking about esteeming all days alike versus esteeming one day better than the other. I don't think that he's necessarily talking about people who disregard feasts altogether, but rather people who are disagreeing about which feast days are more holy or which feast days land on which day. And I do have some evidence for that we're going to get to in a second, but let's keep reading. If we jump down to verse 13, this is what Paul says. He says, "Therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or a hindrance in the way of a brother." He's telling you that if you guys have disagreements on which days are great, don't let that stop you from getting together and being understanding of each other and not holding each other to that in a form of judgment, but to understand that maybe someone's wrong, maybe you're wrong, and still get together in fellowship, because the one that you're going to have to make accord to is going to be God himself, not each other. If we go to verse 19, "So then let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding." Yeah, that's what we should be doing. Continuing on, this is the last passage we're going to read, verse 22 through 23. It says, "The faith that you have, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the one who has no reason to pass judgment on himself for what he approves. But whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not from faith. For whatever does not proceed from faith is sin." Now, this isn't just about eating, of course. This is about all these extra little things that are not necessarily a matter of sin. You know, if somebody thinks that they shouldn't eat something, I'm not going to make it a problem for them. If they think that the feast days land on a different day, okay, fine. I would still like to get together with them. In fact, I highly disagree with the Zadok calendar for a number of reasons, but I know a lot of people really like it. And so if somebody comes along to me that keeps the Zadok calendar and asks me to have Passover dinner with them on a day that fits that calendar, I'm going to say, cool, man. Okay, let's do it. Even though I don't think that's when the holy day is. I'll go ahead and do an extra one. As long as I'm gathering together with my brothers to do it and we can all come together, we're trying our best here, and no one really knows for sure. We're trying our best. And before I get to a passage that I want to share with you that bolsters that idea that we're trying our best and God's okay with that, even when we sometimes get it a little wrong, and he does, I'll show you. Something I want to bring up is that part of the reason I think that Paul might be talking about this is because even during his time, there were debates about the calendar. Did you know that it wasn't all hunky-dory and everybody agreed? No, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, these three different religious groups had very, very different ideas on how to calculate the Feast of First Fruits and subsequently how to calculate the Feast of Weeks. And it was a huge point of debate, even during Paul and Jesus' time. So there's always been calendar issues. I have a really fascinating article that I'm going to link in the description of this video. So you go down there and you can click on it, and it talks a little bit about the history regarding the debates surrounding the Feast of Weeks and how it's calculated between the three different groups. And they each have their own way of doing it. And I agree with the Sadducees' method of doing it. The Sadducees, I think, probably are the most accurate, but I really don't have a lot of good evidence for that, aside from the fact that if you look at the resurrection story when Jesus resurrects, if you have the idea that these major actions that Jesus has taken corresponds with the feasts, then his resurrection landing on the Feast of First Fruits makes a lot of spiritual sense. And the Sadducees would calculate it in that way. The Pharisees and the Essenes each have their own way of doing it as well. But again, I don't want you guys to sweat those kind of details too much. I mean, I want to encourage you to learn. Go ahead and study it out. Study it out as much as you want, as if you think it's going to be fruitful. But if you find yourself becoming like those I've met who allow it to become a hindrance to them getting together in love, then you're taking it too far. You're taking it too far, and maybe it's time to take a step back. But I get what you want to do. You want to serve God as best as possible. So it's really important to you that you get these days right. And I get it. I went through that same thing. I still feel that way, but it's not as high on my priority list as it used to be. So I want to bring a word of comfort to you. And I want you to take a look with me at 2 Chronicles chapter 30. This is an amazing story. So for quick context, this is in the kingdom of Judah under the reign of King Hezekiah, when he's rededicated the temple and he was ready to start getting the feasts going again. We're going to jump down to verse 15. And they slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the 2nd month. And the priests and the Levites were ashamed, so that they consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings into the house of the Lord. They took their accustomed posts according to the law of Moses, the man of God. The priests threw the blood that they had received from the hands of the Levites, for there were many in the assembly who had not consecrated themselves. Therefore the Levites had to slaughter the Passover lamb for everyone who was not clean, to consecrate it to the Lord. For a majority of the people, many of them from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun, had not cleansed themselves, yet they ate the Passover otherwise than as prescribed. For Hezekiah had prayed for them, saying, May the good Lord pardon everyone who sets his heart to seek God, the Lord, the God of his fathers, even though not according to the sanctuary's rules of cleanness. And the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people. This is amazing, because not only were the people unclean, and if you're unclean, you can't participate in the Passover. You're not supposed to. But tons of people were unclean. The priests didn't sound like they had enough labor to go around and help everyone, so they had to do things for people. It was a very stressful event. And did you catch that they were holding the Passover on the 14th day of the 2nd month? The Passover is on the 14th day of the 1st month, so they're doing it in the wrong month. Now, there is a second Passover that God made specifically for people who, due to uncontrollable circumstances, ended up being unclean during the first Passover. There is a Passover in the 2nd month as well. So they're doing the secondary Passover, but this isn't the intent, and this isn't what you would want to do. This is part of the reason why the priests were ashamed, because the people were unclean, they were doing it on the wrong day. It was a huge mess. But the important part here was that Hezekiah prayed for them. God heard it and healed them. Okay, jumping down a little bit later in the chapter, verse 23 says, Then the whole assembly agreed together to keep the feast for another 7 days. So they kept it for another 7 days with gladness. For Hezekiah, king of Judah, gave the assembly 1,000 bulls and 7,000 sheep for offerings, and the princes gave the assembly 1,000 bulls and 10,000 sheep, and the priests consecrated themselves in great numbers. The whole assembly of Judah and the priests and the Levites and the whole assembly came out of Israel, and the sojourners who came out of the land of Israel and the sojourners who lived in Judah rejoiced. So there was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. Then the priests and the Levites arose and blessed the people, and their voice was heard, and their prayer came to his holy habitation in heaven. So all the stuff I mentioned, and then not only that, they kept the feast for twice as long as God told them to do it. But they were doing it out of joy and love of God. That's the thing. They were coming together in earnest love and not just doing it through this arbitrary list of rules. They were really trying to serve God. God healed them, and God heard it in heaven. He accepted it. They did it on the wrong days. So we're trying our best. We're trying our best. And we're probably not getting the feast days right. And as much as my understanding of Scripture went into this calendar, I'm probably not getting them right. But this shouldn't be a point of argument, because if you're so afraid of getting it right here, Hezekiah didn't get it right and God accepted it. It's okay. You're trying your best. God isn't some bureaucratic robot that can't make distinctions when looking at the facets of our life. He's not black and white. Yes, no, you did it wrong. You know, he sees that we live in a very wicked time where we are deceived and we don't have all the information. He knows that. He knows that. And he's going to be accepting of that. So don't let your fascination with the calendar stop you from getting together, okay? It's frankly a topic I'm tired of talking about at this point in my life. So that's why I made this video. I'm glad I'm done with it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you have a really good week moving forward. As always, please consider sharing this video with your brothers and sisters so that maybe they can get a better perspective of the calendar. I'm sure you know someone who's really hung up on this, but hopefully this will bring peace and help them relax, you know. I don't want to be the guy that's straining out a gnat but swallowing a camel. You know what I'm saying? So yes, please share, like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. And I want to say that if you are in the Albany area, yeah, I'm making videos like this, but if you live in Albany, Oregon, or are around there or passing through, considering visiting Sojourn Fellowship Church. We still have fellowship every week. We meet every week, and it'd be wonderful to have you. In person is always better than on video. So I hope you have a wonderful day.